Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Geelong Library and Heritage Centre. My name is Charlotte Guest, and I'm pleased to have been invited to facilitate this evening's conversation with Natasha Lester, discussing her latest book, The Chateau on Sunset. I would like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation and the Gulajan and Gadabanud peoples of the Maar Nations as the original owners of the lands on which our library services operate. We pay respects to elders past and present. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. Before we begin, just some quick housekeeping. Tonight's event is being recorded. If you'd like to revisit the discussion or share it with friends and family, it will be available on the library's YouTube channel in the coming days. If you have any concerns about the recording, just let the staff know. Now on to the main event. I'm pleased to be moderating this conversation with Natasha Lester. In the early 2000s, Natasha made the move from marketing manager for Maybelline Cosmetics to writing novels, and she regrets nothing. She is now a New York Times best-selling and award-winning author of 10 books that have been translated into 21 languages and published all around the world. Picking up a Natasha Lester novel, a reader should expect to find strong female characters, beguiling world cities such as Paris, New York, Venice and LA, and historical periods brought vividly to life. Natasha has a particular knack for plucking women from history out of obscurity, both real and invented women, and honouring their fierce spirits with absorbing stories. In this respect, The Chateau on Sunset continues in this tradition, but in some major ways it also marks a departure from Natasha's previous work, which we will discuss tonight. Natasha, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's very lovely to be back here in Geelong. Just making sure you guys can hear me down the back. Yay.
So The Chateau on Sunset has really only just been released, and so not many people in the room will have had a chance to read it yet. Perhaps we could start off by introducing the book.
Of course. So The Chateau on Sunset is a reimagining of Jane Eyre, set at Hollywood's infamous Chateau Marmont Hotel during the 1950s and 1960s.
Let's linger a little bit on the inspiration for the book. Can you tell us about your personal connection to Jane Eyre and why you thought it was ripe for a retelling?
So I first read Jane Eyre when I was 10 years old. My family would go to the library, our local Duncraig library, every week and get out as many books as we could check out on our library card. And when you go to the library every week of your life and check out the limit of books, you work your way through the Enid Blytons and the horse books quite quickly. And so you have to sort of spread your horizons a little further. So at the age of 10, I decided that as they wouldn't let me into the adult section of the library yet, then I would make my way through the most adult-looking books in the children's section, which were the classics. So I scanned along the shelf, starting at A, and the first one I landed upon was Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. The book that I pulled off the shelf had, and I tried to find on the internet the exact one, and I can't, but I found one that was quite similar. It had Rochester on a horse taking up at least half of the front cover, and down in the bottom left-hand corner was this teeny tiny woman with a bonnet on her head, and that was Jane, the woman whose name is on the front cover of the book, is the smallest thing on the front cover of the book, which didn't strike me as particularly odd back when I was 10. I hadn't yet developed my feminist sensibilities, and I sat down to read the book, and I was totally enraptured by that story. I felt like I finally understood what this word passion meant. You know, Rochester and Jane's relationship was so passionate. I was fascinated by the idea of a mad woman lurking in an attic who would cackle in the middle of the night and set fire to things and stab people, and Helen Burns, Jane's friend, dying of consumption. So all the really dark, tragic things really stuck with me. And it wasn't until I went back and read the book later as an adult that I suddenly thought, wow, isn't it interesting that, once again, Jane, the main character, wasn't the thing that stuck with my 10-year-old self. So when I went back and reread it as an adult, I really reread it focusing on her and truly appreciating how heroic, how feminist, how independent she was as a character for the time in which Charlotte Bronte was writing. But the reason I think that I felt it was most ripe for kind of a reimagining was that going back and reading it as an adult, what really sprung out of the book for me was the many, many occasions where Jane is standing in the gardens at Lowood School or on the roof of Thornfield Hall, and she's looking out at the hills that are the barrier between her and the rest of the world. And Charlotte Bronte uses this language. Jane is yearning and longing to cross over those hills and see something more of England than this tiny slice of life that she, as an orphan, dependent upon the charity of others, is allowed to see. On the very first page of the novel, she's reading a book about birds, and birds from the Arctic, birds from Siberia, and once again she's imagining what it would be like to travel to the Arctic, to travel to Siberia. But in Jane Eyre, the one time she kind of gets to go beyond the hill, she runs across some moors, as you do, because it's a Bronte novel and you've got to run across a moor when you're in a Bronte novel. And she ends up in a house with a man who's different to Rochester, probably even more deranged than Rochester might be. So she runs back the way she came, ends up back in Thornfield Hall, marries Rochester. It's a really romantically satisfying ending, but going back to it as an adult, I thought, wow, how personally satisfying was that for Jane? Was there ever a moment later where she didn't regret her choice, but regretted the fact that she had never crossed over those hills and gone to see the Arctic, gone to visit Siberia, gone to see the wider world beyond that lay on the other side of those hills? So what I wanted to do in writing The Chateau on Sunset is let Jane have both a romantically satisfying and a personally satisfying ending, one that gives her the ending that I feel that the character of Jane Eyre truly deserves.
Perhaps at this juncture I could ask you to read the beautiful quote that opens the book, just because it captures a lot of what you were discussing there. It is from the classic Jane Eyre. Would you be able to read this sentence for us?
Of course. It's a very classic line from the novel, so you might have heard it before, but it is, "I see at intervals the glance of a curious sort of bird through the close-set bars of a cage. A vivid, restless, resolute captive is there. Were it but free, it would soar cloud high."
I think the first time that I read Jane Eyre, I was 14, and the thing that I remembered or took from it most was the idea of the red room. And every time I got grounded and was sent to my room, I think, "This is my red room." So maybe let's introduce Aria, which is our Jane Eyre counterpart in the Chateau on Sunset. Where do we meet her at the beginning of the novel, and what can you tell us about her?
So Aria arrives at the Chateau Marmont on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood as a not quite 14-year-old girl. Her parents have both recently died, and she's been sent to live with her aunt, a woman whose name is Miss Divine Ray, which Aria finds completely out of this world and exotic and insane. And she's standing in the lobby of the Marmont waiting for her aunt to come down and claim her, and nobody turns up. And she feels like she's literally been delivered to the chateau like a piece of junk mail and is as neglected as a piece of junk mail. Luckily, a couple of young starlets see her standing there in the lobby and they take Aria into their care. So she's a not quite 14-year-old. She's looking at the world of Hollywood through the eyes of a not quite 14-year-old. And initially, as it would for most not quite 14-year-olds, the world of Hollywood seems amazing, incredible. She's surrounded by stars and starlets, actresses and actors who she's seen on the screen. She can't quite believe that she can reach out and touch and talk to these people. But also, she's very much the kind of person who doesn't quite fit into the Marmont. This is not her world. And I suppose what I was drawing on there is that idea that, you know, when you're writing a book like my previous novel, The Mademoiselle Alliance, where you're writing about a woman who was the leader of a resistance network, it's very easy to make that woman into the hero of the book because everything she did was so heroic. But what I wanted to do here was take a more ordinary, typical person, could be any one of us here in the room, going to a strange place, feeling like they didn't fit in, which most people have at some point in their life, and saying, okay, how can we make this almost invisible person into the kind of hero that we're all rooting for.
So the Chateau Marmont, the setting of the book, it is a real hotel in Los Angeles where you in fact stayed for a little while whilst researching the book. And it made me think of other famous American hotels like the iconic Chelsea Hotel in New York. And these places, they have such an allure and there's such a setting for stories to unfold. Perhaps you can take us there. What is the Marmont actually like? The architecture, the history. What was your stay like when you were researching? There's a no photos rule?
Correct. No photos rule. So, of course, when you're writing a book set at a place like the Chateau Marmont, which has a no photography rule, it's very difficult to conjure up what the place actually looks like unless you go there. So I suffered for my art. I travelled all the way to Los Angeles and I stayed at the Chateau Marmont. And almost every actor you can think of has lived at the Chateau Marmont for some period of time, particularly through the golden age of Hollywood, although it is still as much a favourite with stars as it ever has been. So I got there wanting to get a feel for the layout because I knew there was a pool, I knew there were bungalows, I knew there was a garden, I knew there was the main building, but where were all these things in relation to each other? How could I map that out onto the page so that, like in all of my other books, readers feel like they're actually there? So it's really interesting. The minute you walk in, you can feel the history literally bleeding from the walls. It's that kind of place. Like if those walls could talk, the stories they could tell. Every room is completely different to the next. It was built as an apartment, a block of apartments. So the rooms are big. They've got kitchens and bathrooms and sitting rooms, etc. They were all furnished back in the 1930s. The Marmont bought out the entire households from once rich Californians who'd gone broke in the Great Depression and were selling off their furniture to raise money. So all of those original pieces of furniture are still in each room. It means every room is different. I stayed there in one suite with a terrace the first time, which looks out across at the penthouse, which features quite heavily in the book. And then I actually ended up staying there a second time by accident. How do you stay at a hotel by accident, you're wondering? So after I'd stayed at the Marmont the first time, I was going to Las Vegas after that to speak at the Historical Novel Society conference, which was being held in Vegas. Did my speech there, went back to Vegas airport to fly back to Perth, going via LA, changing planes. But half an hour after I arrived at Vegas airport, a dust storm arrived in the middle of Las Vegas, and I can say I do not recommend being caught in an airport in a dust storm because they closed the entire airport down for hours and then they had a backlog of planes to work through. So it meant that I got onto my plane 8 hours later than I should have, so I was missing my connection. It had already gone, my connection from LA to Perth. So I had to find somewhere to stay in LA for the night, somewhere that would be open at 1 o'clock in the morning to check me in, would feed me at 1 o'clock in the morning, and that wasn't some dodgy motel out by LAX, which if you've ever seen those motels out by LAX, that's serial killer territory, right? So I thought, okay, I don't have the mental capacity to deal with this right now. I'll just ring the Marmont and see if they've got a room. So I called them and I said, I'm arriving at like 1 o'clock in the morning. Is that going to be okay? They're like, yes, Mrs. Lester, don't worry. We'll have your room ready for you. And they did, down to the personalised stationery. Every time you stay there, on the Chateau Marmont letterhead, they leave you some sheets in your room with your name on there, in residence, Natasha Lester. And it was all waiting for me at 1 a.m.
That is impressive. When I was reading a little bit about the hotel, I thought it was fascinating how when it was built in 1929, it is itself modelled on a French royal castle. So you're writing a book that is remodelling or reinventing a classic, and the setting itself sort of speaks to that, a recasting, a rebuilding from another original. I thought that was really, those synchronicities were really interesting.
Absolutely. And the funny thing was, I had always imagined it being a very gothic kind of place, and it is very gothic. It's exactly Thornfield Hall, but a more modern version of that.
So there is a famous quote which you do weave into the novel by one of the presidents of Columbia Pictures who says, "If you must get into trouble, go to the Marmont." And indeed, some of Hollywood's most notorious scandals of the 50s and 60s take place in the hotel. Can you give us maybe just a flavour of this, and then tell us how you went about weaving this sometimes stranger than fiction history into the novel itself?
Yeah, so that was Columbia Pictures President Harry Cohen who said that about the Marmont. And the reason he said that was because back in the 1930s, he had 3 stars to look after who had just signed to Columbia Pictures: Glenn Ford, Humphrey Bogart and Errol Flynn. And they were not particularly well-behaved young men. And in those days, every actor had a morality clause in their contract. They had to behave themselves. And these 3 young men were not complying with the rules. And it was getting out in the media. And that was problematic because they could misbehave as much as they liked so long as nobody found out about it in Harry Cohen's eyes. So he had a problem he needed to solve. And he knew about this place, the Chateau Marmont, that was back then on the far outskirts of Hollywood. And he thought, okay, what if I get them a suite at the Marmont, all paid for by the studio, everything paid for, whatever they want to do at the hotel, it's all paid for by me. And I put them there, right on the edge of Hollywood. Surely nobody will find out if they're so far out of town. So that's what he did, and he was right. Nobody ever reported anything that those 3 young men got up to at the Chateau Marmont at that time in the 1930s. So from that time on, it earned the reputation as being the place where you could go and do whatever you liked, and it would remain a secret. And while that on the one hand means that it attracted stars of every kind, young starlets, more established stars, and it means that the hotel has this fabulous history of stories, many of which are very funny, like, for example, when Grace Kelly stayed there, when she was trying to break into acting before she became Princess Grace. The staff talk about the way that she would stand in the lobby, dressed in her long white gloves, very elegant, looking as innocent as all get out, watching everybody check into the hotel, and anytime a really hot young guy checked into the hotel, she'd made friends with the switchboard operator. So she'd go and ask the switchboard operator for his room number, and then she'd go up and knock on his door and introduce herself to him. And I won't tell you any more about what she got up to with these young men. I'll leave that to your imagination. Vivian Leigh lived there for quite some time while she was separating from and divorcing Laurence Olivier. She was devastated. She adored Laurence. The staff estimate she had about 300 photos of him in her suite at the Marmont at that time, except in her bedroom, where she decided that the Marmont's artwork was not up to her standards. She had all the paintings removed from the walls and replaced them with her own personal collection of Van Goghs and Picassos. So you've got all these, great, funny, slightly mischievous stories, but you also have many other stories that were not quite so mischievous and that got swept under the carpet. And one of those is to do with the movie A Rebel Without a Cause, which was scripted, dreamed up, cast, rehearsed in bungalow number 5 of the Chateau Marmont, which still stands there on the grounds. Nicholas Ray, the director of the movie, lived in bungalow number 5 for the duration of the shooting of Rebel Without a Cause. As we all know, James Dean starred in that movie. He starred alongside a young woman named Natalie Wood, who many people don't remember. Certainly many people don't know Natalie's kind of backstory. So she had been cast in a couple of roles prior to that, cast in sort of the role of the goody two-shoes, and she wanted to break out of that. She wanted to show that she had a more diverse acting range. So she got herself along to the Marmont, tapped on the door of bungalow number 5, where everybody knew Nicholas Ray was living, the director of this movie that was going to be made, and she pleaded with him to cast her, or at least audition her for the role. And he said he didn't think she was right for the part. So she went out one night with a group of other actors who were all staying at the Marmont, got blindingly drunk, drove her car, smashed her car very badly, got taken to hospital, ended up ringing Nicholas Ray from the hospital and said to him, "The doctor called me a goddamn juvenile delinquent. Now do I get the part?" And he actually gave her the part, But he also then embarked upon a relationship with Natalie. Now, the important thing to note here is that he was 43 years old and Natalie Wood was 16 years old. The age of consent in California at the time was 18. She was 16. She had a relationship with him and also one with Billy Wilder, who was writing the script, at the Marmont, basically simultaneously. And it's at least dubious, the fact that she was only 16 and he was 43 years old and in a position of power. And of course, nobody found out about that relationship at the time. Nobody tried to stop it, nobody tried to counsel Natalie, nobody tried to help her. And as a result of that, a number of other reasonably tragic things happened to Natalie at the Marmont, which I talk about in the author's note of the book, and I'll let you take a look at those. But it's women like that, women who we see on screens promoting the dream, giving us hopes and aspirations, giving us hours of entertainment, telling us stories, who faced every day of their lives all of these barriers and battles and compromises and demeaning actions and things that they had to do, who we don't often think about as heroes, but whose stories are nonetheless as important, because as I was writing this book, I realised this is the genesis of what we found out during Me Too. This is where it all began. And the reason it continued for decades and decades and decades is because if you must get into trouble, do it at the Marmont where nobody will ever find out. And I feel like in contemporary times when we're in danger of maybe losing some of that ground that we gained during Me Too, these kinds of stories are really important to make us remember why it was so important to celebrate those moments when we had some wins.
So young Aria, she arrives at the hotel and she's nearly 14. She's met by two starlets in the lobby. Now, of course, there is, being a reinvention of Jane Eyre, there is a romance plot, but also at the forefront of the story is female friendship, which is a huge theme in the book. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, because you centre them alongside and even foreground some of the female friendships in this book, which I think is a really deliberate choice of yours.
Yeah, so I was really influenced here by, in the original classic, Jane's friendship with people like Helen Burns and Miss Temple at her school, who were really formative for her and formed that support network that she needed to become the woman who emerged out of, the kind of charity school that she was sent to. But I was also equally thinking about a 14-year-old arriving in this kind of environment and what kind of support network she might need. And what I wanted to draw on there was the way that women come together and form these circles around each other that are beautiful and kind and generous and supportive. It's the kind of thing where in the handbags in this room, someone has a Panadol, someone has a Band-Aid, someone has a tampon. And if any woman in this room needed one of those things, you could walk up to any woman, complete stranger, and ask for one of those things, and it will be handed over, no questions asked. Because that's what women do for each other. That's how we care for each other, how we support each other. And that's how, when push comes to shove, we can band together to do things like the Me Too movement. But it also made me think about the whisper networks that women have to warn each other, to protect each other, to keep each other safe. I'll never forget, as a 20-year-old, having finished university, starting my first full-time job at an advertising agency, and I thought it was going to be so exciting. I was working at an ad agency. It was my first job. I was naive and bright and shiny and young. And it was exactly like Mad Men. It had not evolved, even though this was the 1990s. They even still smoked in the office, which, I just can't even believe it wasn't that long ago. And we had a party for our clients. And I was talking to this guy who was a client, a very senior client of ours. And he was the same age as my dad, so, I didn't really think anything of it. And one of the other women in the agency came up to me and said, just kind of whispered in my ear in a moment where she could, just be careful of him when he's had a few drinks. And as it turned out, she was right to warn me, and thank goodness she did. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I was like, what? It's like my dad. But those whisper networks that women have and have always had, so Flitter and Calliope, who have ridiculous names, but they are actresses. They're their stage names. In the 1950s, a lot of actresses did have crazy stage names, and I was having a little bit of fun with those. Form part of that whisper network in the Marmont that Aria then joins to try to keep all of the women warned about the dangers that might be lurking on their path as they make their way through the halls of the Chateau Marmont.
So speaking of female agency and female power in the novel, this latest novel fits firmly within the genre of Gothic literature, which is that departure perhaps from, previous novels of yours that I was alluding to in the introduction. And you wrote a really fascinating Substack post, a blog post, about why Gothic literature is the perfect vehicle through which to explore female agency and power. And I found this really fascinating because how exactly is the Gothic genre suited to allowing female characters to flourish and step into their own? It might not necessarily seem so on the surface, but you really unpack that in that post and is obviously speaking to what you've done in the latest book.
Yeah, so I've always loved a good Gothic novel. I mean, Rebecca is such a classic Gothic novel that I've always loved. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, another amazing Gothic novel that I've always loved. And it's always women writing these really powerful Gothic novels. And if you look at all of them, Wuthering Heights included, Jane Eyre included, they're very, very feminist. And that was what I wanted to bring to the fore here in this book. And I think the reason for that is they're so often in these closed environments where you can't escape. And so when you can't escape as a woman, you draw on your own resources and your own inner strength, and you discover how much you have inside you, prompted by the very confinement of the environment around you, prompted by scary red rooms, prompted by cackles and laughter in the middle of the night, prompted by fires and stabbings and all those other mysterious things. That's where women rise up. We aren't the ones running to hide ourselves in the cupboard. We're the ones going out into the hall to find out what the hell is going on. And so that was kind of what I wanted to do with this book, is to show how in these places where you think people wouldn't flourish, how women are like the weed and we manage to grow anywhere.
In that same post, we might think of Gothic literature as having very European origins, and a lot of the examples from classic literature are, of course, Frankenstein and, the others that you mentioned. But in that recommendations list, you had some excellent Australian authored examples of contemporary Gothic literature. I wondered if you wanted to talk about those.
Yeah, I feel like Gothic lit is really having a resurgence, a bit like classic lit, which is also having a bit of a resurgence with all the adaptations that are happening. And I wonder if that is in response to this sense that certainly in certain parts of the world, women's rights are being eroded. We're hopeful that that won't happen here. So I feel like Australian authors are really tapping into this as, a very feminist form of literature that can remind us through the power of storytelling of what we can do as women if we don't just kind of dream of a better future. We take some action towards that better future, whatever small, tiny action that we can take on any one day. One of the books I mentioned there was Charlotte McConaughey's Wild Dark Shore. Has anyone read that? I mean, that's a great Gothic, it's so creepy, you don't really know what's going on. It's isolated, they're stuck in the lighthouse, someone's died, you don't know why or who or how. We're very confined. And it's all about how that one woman comes into that story and she shakes it all up. I love a book where that happens.
This might be the perfect moment to talk about Wuthering Heights. We have to talk about it. It seems like Wuthering Heights fever has gripped the world of late, thanks to the film adaptation that is very polarising, if anyone has seen it. Of course, we have Emerald Fennell's film. Now we have the Chateau on Sunset, which is looking at a different Bronte sister. But I wondered, are we having a Bronte moment? And perhaps you've already sort of touched on this a little bit, but why now, and why do we think the Brontes in particular? What is it about them as sisters?
Has anyone seen the Wuthering Heights adaptation? A few people have. So, will you ever look at an egg the same way ever again for the rest of your life? I don't think I will. You have to go and see the movie now to work out what I'm talking about. So the interesting thing about Wuthering Heights is when Emerald Fennell was interviewed, she talked about the fact that that movie adaptation is the impression she had of the book back when she first read it. I think she said she was 12 when she first read that book. And that really resonated with me, because if I made a movie that was the Jane Eyre of my 10-year-old self, it would be a very different creature to this book, because it would be full of the Red Room and women dying of consumption and mad women going wild, and Jane wouldn't have much of a role, whereas Jane is the hero of this book. But I think the reason the Brontes are having a moment is because those three sisters. Who's read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte? Has anyone? Amazing feminist work of fiction. Like, you have to read that. I reckon it's almost it's better than Wuthering Heights, almost as good as Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. These three incredibly feminist works that were very different for their time, so out there. People couldn't believe the kinds of things that were contained in these novels, published under three kind of semi-male pseudonyms. People couldn't quite work out who had written these books, particularly in relation to Jane Eyre. She published that as Carabelle. And there's this very famous anecdote about a woman in London reading the book and knowing immediately that it was written by a woman and not by a man, because the descriptions of Jane doing embroidery were such that she could not imagine any man ever having the level of knowledge required to write the embroidery scenes like that. I thought, wow, isn't that fantastic, the way women can pick up on things like that? So I feel like the Brontes are having a moment, because we're going back and rediscovering how unique their voices were for their time in history. There have been no other three sisters who grew up together in such a confined, tiny house, a dark house in the middle of nowhere, who had the range of imagination. Whether you love or hate those books, Wuthering Heights is not a favourite of mine, but I can do nothing but admire Emily Bronte's inventiveness and her imagination. And for that to have risen up out of that tiny speck in the middle of nowhere, the most desolate wilderness place, is quite extraordinary.
There's something really mesmerising about their dynamic as sisters as well. I remember reading about in the parsonage how their habit was, as the three of them, to walk around the table in the dining room, which is not very big. As you say, every room is tiny. And they would read out loud to each other and edit as they go and discuss. And then, of course, Anne dies, and then the two of them walk, and then Emily dies, and then Charlotte walks around the table by herself. And she continues that habit for the rest of her own life. And there's something really special and heartbreaking and beautiful about the dynamic between three incredible authors and three sisters. And you have been there and you saw the aura of the place as well. Were you shocked when you saw how dark and small and, tiny this place was, that held such huge imaginations?
Oh, absolutely. I knew it would have to be sort of small and dark because it was such an old place, but I was not prepared for that. But what really struck me when I was there was what a writers group that would have been. And Charlotte and Emily Bronte all working on their manuscripts together. Talk about writerly dream writers groups. That would be the best. Can you imagine eavesdropping on their conversations? Charlotte, who was really the bossy one and kind of probably the leader of the group in a way, she was the one who persuaded Emily to publish her work. Emily was not wanting to publish any of her work. You can imagine her kind of trying to boss the other two, and Emily just sitting there not saying anything and going, yeah, I'm not going to change that. It would have been fabulous. It's one of the other, they have a lot of documentations and paintings and that kind of thing there, and one of them is of one of Emily's dogs. She had a lot of dogs in her life and she was very close to her dogs, and there's this story that she was trying to train this particular dog not to go and lie down on her bed, and it kept doing it. And she kept telling it off, and then it went and did it this one day, and when it came back down the stairs, she hit the dog so violently that it couldn't see out of its eyes. They were all closed up. And it's so interesting to hear that anecdote and look at Wuthering Heights and what happens to the dogs in that book, and how back in the day, that was how people punished animals. It was a very different kind of mentality and approach towards animals if you were on kind of a farm than we have today. But you can kind of see some of the source material for their books when you go there and read those kinds of little anecdotes about the girls.
Now we have to allocate a little bit of time to talking about your version of Mr. Rochester, which you have styled very differently. There are, of course, parallels, but he is a different man. Can you introduce Theo Winchester for us, your version of Rochester?
So Theo Winchester is a rock star. He's a recovering alcoholic. He has been left a 14-year-old daughter in a will. And so he has come to the Chateau Marmont to learn to be a dad to this 14-year-old girl. So he's the kind of guy, rock star in recovery. You'd think he'd be down there at the pool, shirtless, partying hard with the rest of them. But what I wanted to do here was, in the same way that Rochester has got this mansion in Jane Eyre, this beautiful house, he has the appearance of being the kind of guy who would be having lavish parties with all of the people from his level of society around. He never quite fits into his own house. He's always like a fish out of water. I wanted to put my Theo Winchester into the Marmont as a bit of a fish out of water so that he's not quite what you're expecting. He isn't the one down by the pool jumping shirtless in and making the biggest splash you could imagine and getting totally wasted with all the other stars and starlets. He's just there to learn how the hell you become a father to a 14-year-old, because as anyone who has been a 14-year-old girl can attest, they're not the easiest creatures in the world.
Now, we should probably mention at this juncture that there are two timelines. There's the timeline where Aria is 14, and then there's the timeline where she's 21. That's probably important to mention as well. And speaking of multiple timelines, I've noticed in a number of your books that you do manage multiple timelines as sort of a structuring device to build suspense and build the story, and we're switching between the past and whatever the present time of the novel is. And it reminded me of a chat I had with another author who said that as a writer, she finds managing multiple timelines surprisingly easier than trying to do a single linear plot, which might seem kind of counterintuitive because it's so complex, having years jump around and making them all fit together. And I wondered if you could comment on that as well, because it's a characteristic that carries across a number of your books.
I think that every time you sit down to write a book, you delude yourself into thinking, oh, this is going to be easy. And then once you're too far into it to back out, you realise that, oh no, shit, this is not quite as easy as I was imagining it was going to be. I like multiple timelines because I think it does allow you to set up a greater sense of suspense. I also like it because it's a bit of a puzzle for the readers in terms of working out how do these timelines fit together, how do the characters in these timelines fit together. But for this book, what I wanted to do was give readers, like you have in Jane Eyre, a younger person and see how they grow over the course of the story into adulthood, and see what kind of person can emerge from the glamour and the chaos and the darkness of the Chateau Marmont, become the kind of person who can rule the world. So that's why we've got these two timelines 7 years apart, because I didn't want to just give the reader all of the childhood kind of story, the 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old storyline right up front, because people are used to my women characters being older, and so I was worried that they might find that too disorientating. So that's why we swap in and out of Aria as a 14-year-old and Aria as a young woman, a 21-year-old. And it's kind of fun to see how all the characters have, or in some cases have not changed over the course of that 7 years. And we're left wondering about something that happened back when Aria was 14. What was that? Why has that had such a big impact on her, on Flitter, on Calliope, on many other people at the chateau? How will it continue to play out as Aria gets older and older? And will she ever be able to overcome whatever it was that happened in a room of the Chateau Marmont in the dark of night?
Now, we will open up for audience questions in a couple of minutes, so get thinking. But I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask about your career as a writer, because I know people are always fascinated in the careers of authors and the working lives of authors. So we mentioned in your bio to start with that you were working at Maybelline in the early 2000s and you quit to pursue writing, and that must have been such a leap of faith. What went into that decision before you left and took this full time?
Sometimes I think leaps of faith are better taken without doing too much thinking. Otherwise, if you do, you won't take them. And that was a little bit of the case for this one. So I was working in Melbourne for L'Oreal back when it was in Sandringham. It's on St Kilda Road now. And my husband had followed me across to Melbourne for my work, and then he had to go back to Perth for his job. So it seemed only fair that he'd followed me one way across the country, that I follow him back to Perth, which meant quitting my fabulous job at L'Oreal and being unemployed for the first time in my life, because I'd never left a job without another job to go straight to. And it struck me as this was a moment that you don't get very often in your life to change the path that you're walking down. I could go back to Perth and get another marketing job, knowing it wouldn't be quite as good as the one I had at L'Oreal, because head offices just didn't exist in Perth back then. This is kind of about around 2005. Or I could finally do something about this writing dream that I had had in my head ever since I was like 7 years old and first starting to write my own books and poems and stories. I hadn't done anything about it earlier because there weren't creative writing degrees in Perth back when I left high school, but by this point there were. And so I thought, okay, well, what if I go back, don't get a job, go to university, be the mature age student in the room who asks all the questions, and find out whether I actually enjoy creative writing when I do it. It's all very well to think you might, but maybe the reality might be different. And also to find out whether I was any good at it, because if I was terrible at it, then my dream of being a writer really needed to be cut off at the knees then and there. So I went back to university and I did that, and I loved it, and it seemed like I was okay at it, so I kept going.
So you found your path in creative writing, and you're now known as a best-selling historical fiction writer. But in fact, your first two novels were contemporary fiction. So I wondered, how did you discover that historical fiction is where your passion truly lies? Because you had started out writing with contemporary stories.
So I wrote my first book as my university master's thesis, and back at that time there was an expectation about the type of book you would write as your university master's thesis. It needed to be serious literature. It had to be grim. No one was allowed to smile or have fun. It had to be a bit dark. And so I wrote a book that suited what was expected of me. And then when it came to write the second book, I wrote something in a similar vein, because that was what I'd done the first time around. And then I wrote a third book that was like that too. And it was really hard work. And writing had never been, I mean, it's always difficult, but it had never felt like something that I didn't enjoy. And I didn't enjoy the process of writing that third book. And I got to the end of it and thought, I can't bear the idea of rewriting that. And, you know, I do probably about 5 or 6 drafts now before it goes to editing. But back then I was doing like 10 drafts, and I was like, God, imagine having to rewrite this thing 10 times. Like, I cannot do that. So I thought, I'm going to throw all 85,000 words of this book into the bin. And I was devastated by that, and I sulked for about a month. And my version of sulking was to sit in my chair in my office with all of my favourite books stacked up beside me and just reread them, because I thought, I've lost something. I've lost the joy of writing. I've lost the ability to write. I need to somehow rekindle that, and maybe in reading my favourite novels over again, I'll be able to do that. And I was only about a quarter of the way through that stack when I realised that almost all of them were historical fiction. And I was like, wow, if I like reading historical fiction so much, why the hell am I not writing historical fiction? And it was at that moment when I realised that I'd been writing what I thought I should write, because I had started off in the university environment. And at that moment, sitting in that chair, I said to myself, okay, well, what if you didn't write what you thought you should write? What if you wrote what you really wanted to write? What would that look like? And that was where A Kiss from Mr. Fitzgerald, my first historical novel, came from. And the minute I sat down to write that book, it was the most fun, joyful, fabulous writing experience I had ever had, and I knew exactly that I was doing the right thing.
Perfect moment to open up to the floor. We've got a question down the back. There are roving mics, so just wait for a mic to come to you. We've got one down the back and then a second over the side here.
Hi there. Besides going to the Chateau on Sunset, what other research did you do and how did you do it?
So I always start my research for any of my books with a book that gives a broad overview of whatever it is I happen to be researching. So whether it's female aviators in the Second World War or art thefts during the Second World War. So this time around, I knew there was a book written by a guy called Sean Levi called The Castle on Sunset. And it was a gossipy, fast-paced, non-fiction history of the Marmont. So I started there. And at that point, it appeared to me like most of the stories from the Marmont were like the Grace Kelly, the Vivian Leigh ones, you know, kind of lighthearted, humorous, funny. There was going to be lots of stars. There was going to be lots of fun. That was where it was going to be. But it wasn't until I found some other accounts of the Marmont. There's one written by two guys who used to own the Marmont back in the 70s that they started to talk a little bit more about, for the first time, some of the darker things that went on there. And then I also began to just look up accounts of and interviews by the women who stayed there, and it was reading in their accounts what they experienced, that was when the most interesting stuff came out. And also going back to some newspaper articles that were published back in the 1930s about one woman who something happened to, which I talk about in the author's note, and the studio basically, as they said, you know, we killed her. They didn't physically kill her, but metaphorically, they killed her career. She never acted again because of what she tried to do in speaking out. So I read all of those articles. So there's a lot of information out there if you go digging, and if you've done as much research as I have, you find that you start out here with the most well-known knowledge, and then you dig and you dig and you dig and you dig, and eventually you get to the layer where the most interesting stuff lies, and it's usually in the fossils and bones somewhere.
One of the things that Natasha's books are really renowned for are the author's notes, because it's so fascinating. Having read what you've just read, whether it's Mademoiselle Alliance or The Disappearance of Astrid Picard or the latest Chateau, you then get to see the workings in the succinct, you know, couple of pages of author's note, and the sheer amount of research that goes into these novels is incredible. We had a second question over here.
Thank you. I found Rochester to be very patronising to Jane Eyre. All the dialogue that they share is he's the very much older man, that's one thing, and also so condescending. So in terms of, yes, when you're a teenager, this is a romance that is fulfilled. But when you're rereading it later on, it's a whole different story. I was wondering about your comments.
Yeah, so I think there's one really interesting scene where Jane meets Rochester for the first time, and they're in the parlour and the fire's blazing, and he looks at her and thinks, young little governess, I'm going to get the better of you. And they have this conversation, but she holds her own. Like, she gives back to him, if you go back and reread that scene, as good as she gets. And that's the scene where you go, wow, good on you, Jane. And he is surprised. You know, he is taken aback. He is on the back foot. He's like, oh, okay, I'm not going to be able to get away with what I've always been able to get away with. And I think that's a really great scene because it shows that power can lie in the hands of the underdog, and all the underdog needs is words. And that's all she has in that scene is words. She has no money, no connections, no family, just the power of speech, and everything she says there is word perfect. So what I wanted to do in my book is use the smart, the wit, the intellect of Jane and show how it is that she holds her own in any situation. And I also wanted to make the Rochester character much more contemporary in terms of the kind of guy that we can fall in love with and we don't really feel the way that some people do about Rochester, because I understand some people hate Rochester, some people hate Heathcliff. I feel like you're either Team Rochester or Team Heathcliff. No guesses as to who is on whose side I'm on there. But yeah, it's a really interesting point.
I thought I saw, yes, a third question over here.
Hi, just a question about the cover. I know you put up on your Instagram, you've got the 3 different cover designs. Can you tell me why, and why for different markets you have those different options?
Right. So you mean the 3 different Chateau Marmont,
Yes.
Chateau
Yes.
on Sunset covers?
Yes.
Yeah, I have different publishers in different countries. Every author is published. When you are published in Australia, your Australian publisher has the rights to publish in Australia, and if you're published in America, your American publisher has the right to publish there. So there are 3 different organisations. It's like selling a product at David Jones here in Australia, selling one at Bergdorf Goodman's in America, and selling one at Harrods in the UK. They're different companies, so they choose their own artwork. They create the cover that best suits their market. Yeah, it's just that simple.
Having said, sorry, I was just going to, yeah.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do. Absolutely. But I don't live in the US and I don't live in the UK, so my publishers do. They're the experts. So if they believe that a cover is the right cover for the book, I trust the experts' judgment. If they gave me something I truly loathed, hated and detested, then I would definitely say, but they're pretty good at their jobs, so I let them do their jobs.
I was just going to comment that this particular book marks a new design and art direction for your Australian books, which must be an exciting moment, kind of taking them in a different direction.
Yeah, it is. I just think, we've had the same kind of covers for 10 years, and after 10 years they've been beautiful covers, and I adore and love all the covers that I've had. It's just time for a bit of a refresh, and, this is such a gorgeous cover. We had an Australian artist actually create a painting for this cover, and we used her painting as the cover. So it's actually an original piece of artwork, which I think is incredibly beautiful. And she did the same thing for the new jackets on the Mademoiselle Alliance and the disappearance of Astrid Ricard, created 2 other beautiful works of art for those covers.
That's so special as well, because these new concepts, they have all sorts of symbology in the paintings that once you read the books, it all becomes apparent, and so the covers speak so differently to the text than the previous covers. It's all one, and it's all part and parcel. We are coming to the end of our time together. We do have book sales and signing afterwards. The Bookbird is in the corner with plenty of copies of the Chateau, of course, but also copies of Natasha's previous 2 novels that we have mentioned tonight, as well as a few copies of Jane Eyre in case anyone was tempted.
Oh, yay!
And of course, Natasha will be signing, so do pop in line and get that signature as well. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, ahead of the Easter long weekend. We really appreciate it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, everybody. It was so lovely to see you on a Thursday right before Good Friday. I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. That was super fun. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. No, it was a great question. So that, yeah, I did. It was lots of fun. No. It is. Oh, 100%.